My name is Marcus Hale, and before everything fell apart, I thought I understood who I was and where my life was headed. I was 32 years old then, an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Austin, Texas, the kind of job that didn't make headlines but paid well enough to build a future if you were patient and disciplined. I'm not the sort of man who ever expected things to be handed to him. I worked long hours, climbed rung by rung, and took pride in being reliable rather than flashy. People used to say I was steady, predictable, and maybe a little boring, but I believed those were strengths, especially when it came to love and commitment. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, share this video, subscribe, and comment now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met Lena Brooks when I was 27 and she was 25, in a way that felt ordinary enough at the time that I never imagined it would define the rest of my life. We were both waiting in line at a downtown coffee shop on a rainy Saturday morning, and she made a joke about how the city shut down every time the weather turned slightly dramatic. She had a warm laugh and eyes that made you feel like she was actually listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. Lena worked as a marketing coordinator for a boutique real estate firm, ambitious and creative, always talking about campaigns, branding ideas, and the kind of lifestyle she wanted to build one day. Our relationship grew the way most people hope theirs will, steadily and with a sense of shared direction. We moved in together after 2 years, splitting rent in a modest apartment not far from my office. By the time I proposed, I was 30 and she was 28, and we talked openly about marriage as a partnership, something we would build together rather than inherit. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, and I believed deeply that comfort earned together meant more than luxury given by someone else. We even talked about our wedding like it was already a memory in progress, laughing about guest lists and arguing playfully about music and venues. If I'm honest, I ignored signs I should have questioned earlier. Lena loved nice things, and there's nothing wrong with that, but over time her tastes grew more expensive, her expectations more precise. She followed influencers who lived in glass houses and wore designer clothes, and sometimes she'd show me pictures and ask, half joking, when we'd be living like that. I would laugh it off and remind her that we were still building, that my career was on an upward track, and that patience mattered. She would smile, kiss me, and say she understood, but there was always a flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes. The day she left me didn't come with a dramatic argument or a slammed door. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost cruelly calm, like a storm that gives no warning before it breaks. I came home from work expecting dinner and our usual routine, only to find the apartment half-packed and Lena sitting at the table with a folder in front of her. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply told me she had outgrown the life we were planning and that she needed more than promises and timelines. Then she handed me a neatly typed list explaining why she was leaving, as if our relationship were a failed business proposal. She told me she had met someone else, a man nearly twice her age, wealthy, established, and already living the kind of life she wanted, now, not someday. She said she didn't want to struggle, didn't want to wait, didn't want to measure happiness in years of effort. Hearing her talk like that felt unreal, like listening to a stranger recite lines meant for someone else. I remember staring at the list in my hands, each bullet point colder than the last, and realizing that the woman I planned to marry had already emotionally packed up long before that day. When Lena walked out, she didn't look back, and for a long time afterward, neither did I. I told myself that being left for a richer, older man was a cliché, something that happened in movies or cautionary tales, not in real life to people like me. I buried myself in work, picked up extra responsibilities, and told everyone I was fine. But late at night, alone in that half-empty apartment, the questions crept in. Was I naive for believing love could outweigh money? Was stability less valuable than spectacle? Those doubts lingered longer than I care to admit. At that point, I had no idea that Lena's decision wasn't the end of my story with her, but the beginning of something far more complicated. I didn't know that the man she chose, the life she chased, and the wedding she planned would one day pull me back into her world in a way none of us expected. All I knew then was that I had been handed a list explaining why I wasn't enough, and that list would quietly fuel every choice I made from that moment forward. The weeks after Lena left blurred together in a way that still feels strange when I look back on it, like time stretched and folded in on itself without my permission. I went through the motions of my days with mechanical precision, waking up early, dressing neatly, and driving to work as if nothing fundamental had changed. At the office, I was praised for my focus and reliability, unaware that what they called discipline was really just avoidance. I stayed late every night, not because the work demanded it, but because the apartment no longer felt like home, just a place filled with echoes of conversations that would never happen again. At night, when silence pressed in too hard to ignore, I replayed everything in my head, searching for the exact moment where things went wrong. I wondered if it was the night I told her we should wait another year before upgrading apartments, or the time I chose to invest extra money into my retirement instead of a luxury vacation she wanted. Those moments felt small back then, responsible even, but in hindsight they loomed large, magnified by regret and self-doubt. I questioned whether love built on patience was outdated in a world obsessed with instant gratification. A month after Lena left, I learned through mutual acquaintances that she was officially engaged to the man she had left me for. His name didn't matter to me then, only what he represented. He was in his late 50s, a real estate investor with properties across several states, the kind of man who wore tailored suits casually and spoke about money as if it were weather, something always present and predictable. When I heard they were planning a wedding barely 6 months after meeting, something inside me tightened, not out of jealousy alone, but disbelief at how quickly she had replaced the life we were building. I won't pretend I handled that news gracefully. For a few days, anger replaced numbness, sharp and energizing in a way that almost felt good. I threw myself into the gym, pushing my body to exhaustion just to feel something tangible again. I upgraded my wardrobe, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that I still had control over who I was becoming. Friends encouraged me to move on, but they didn't understand that moving on wasn't a direction, it was a process, and I was still stuck somewhere in the middle of it. Ironically, it was Lena's departure that opened the door to the biggest professional opportunity of my life. With fewer distractions and an almost obsessive focus, I took on a major logistics overhaul project that senior leadership had avoided for years. I analyzed inefficiencies, renegotiated contracts, and implemented systems that saved the company millions over the next quarter. What started as a coping mechanism turned into momentum, and within 6 months, I was promoted to regional director, a role that came with a significant salary increase and equity options I never imagined I'd have so soon. As my career advanced, so did my perspective. I began to realize that Lena hadn't just left me for money, she had left because she measured worth differently than I did. Where I saw growth, she saw delay. Where I saw foundation, she saw limitation. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it, turning self-blame into clarity. I stopped asking why I wasn't enough and started asking whether I ever would have been, no matter how much I earned or achieved. About a year after our breakup, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my office, forwarded from my old address. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail, until I saw Lena's handwriting on the front. Inside was a wedding invitation, elegant and understated, announcing her upcoming marriage at a luxury vineyard outside the city. There was also a short note, polite and oddly formal, saying she hoped I was doing well, and that it would mean a lot if I attended. I stared at the invitation longer than I care to admit, unsure whether it was an olive branch, a formality, or something else entirely. For days, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to burn the invitation and forget it ever arrived. Another part, quieter but more persistent, felt that attending might offer some kind of closure, a chance to finally put that chapter of my life to rest. I didn't know then that showing up to that wedding would change everything, not just for Lena, but for me as well. All I knew was that the man she once left behind was no longer the same man reading that invitation, and that difference would matter more than anyone realized. I didn't RSVP right away, and that delay said more about my internal conflict than any polite response ever could. The invitation sat on my desk for weeks, occasionally buried under reports and folders, but never forgotten. Every time I caught sight of that cream-colored envelope, it stirred something complicated inside me, a mixture of old hurt and unexpected curiosity. I asked myself what Lena truly wanted by inviting me, whether it was closure for her, validation, or simply a final demonstration of how far she believed she had risen above the life we once planned together. The idea that she might want me there as a silent witness to her upgrade unsettled me more than I expected. As the wedding date approached, I began to realize that my hesitation wasn't rooted in fear of seeing her happy without me, but in uncertainty about who I would be in that room. I had spent the past year rebuilding myself quietly, deliberately, without any intention of proving anything to anyone. Yet part of me wondered if showing up would undermine that growth, reducing me to a footnote in her story instead of the author of my own. At the same time, avoiding the wedding felt like unfinished business, like letting the past decide when I was allowed to move on. What ultimately tipped the balance was a conversation with my mentor at work, a man who had seen enough personal and professional storms to speak with a kind of calm authority I respected. When I explained the situation, he didn't offer advice right away. He simply asked me whether attending the wedding would make me feel smaller or clearer. That question stayed with me long after I left his office, echoing in my thoughts during late-night workouts and early morning drives. I realized that clarity, not pride, was what I needed most. By then, my life looked very different from the one Lena walked away from. I had moved into a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river, not because I needed luxury, but because I could finally choose it without sacrificing my values. My job demanded travel and leadership, and I carried myself with a confidence earned through competence rather than comparison. I hadn't dated seriously since the breakup, but I no longer felt defined by that absence. I was whole again, even if some scars remained. I mailed back the RSVP with a simple confirmation, surprising myself with how steady my hand felt as I did it. There was no dramatic rush of emotion, no surge of adrenaline, just a quiet sense that I was making the right decision for myself. I didn't plan to make a scene or arrive with some grand reveal. I intended to attend, observe, and leave with my dignity intact. Whatever story Lena believed she was telling with that invitation, would write my own ending. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, details trickled in through mutual acquaintances and social media, information I tried not to seek out but couldn't entirely avoid. The venue was extravagant, a vineyard estate known for hosting celebrities and corporate elites. The guest list read like a catalogue of influence and affluence, a world Lena had always admired from a distance. I imagined her in that setting, radiant and triumphant, and wondered whether she felt any trace of the doubt or restlessness that once flickered behind her eyes when she talked about the future with me. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly, without the dread I had anticipated. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored charcoal suit that reflected who I was now, understated but unmistakably confident. As I drove toward the venue, the countryside unfolding in calm greens and golds around me, I felt an unexpected sense of detachment. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing firmly in my own life and acknowledging the path that led me here, even the painful parts. When I arrived, the estate buzzed with preparation and anticipation. Guests mingled on manicured lawns, glasses of champagne catching the light as laughter floated through the air. I checked in, accepted a polite smile from the coordinator, and made my way toward the seating area, aware of curious glances but unconcerned by them. I wasn't there to announce myself, yet my presence carried a quiet weight I could feel in the way conversations paused briefly as I passed. I hadn't seen Lena yet, but I sensed that moment approaching, inevitable as the ceremony itself. Standing there among strangers who knew only fragments of the story, I realized something important. No matter what happened next, no matter how she reacted or how others perceived me, I had already reclaimed something far more valuable than the relationship she left behind. I had reclaimed myself. And that realization, more than any future encounter, made me ready to face whatever awaited me when she finally walked down that aisle. The first time I saw Lena that day wasn't during the ceremony, but in the quiet stretch of moments just before it began, when the estate seemed to hold its breath. I was standing near the edge of the courtyard, watching servers align champagne flutes with almost ceremonial precision, when I felt a shift in the air, the kind that makes you look up without knowing why. She was walking toward a small group of bridesmaids, her dress still partially hidden beneath a silk robe, her hair pinned but unfinished. For a split second, she looked exactly like the woman I once loved, familiar and almost vulnerable, before the polished confidence returned to her posture. When her eyes met mine, the reaction was unmistakable. She froze, not dramatically, but just enough for me to notice the tension ripple through her. Her smile faltered, then reset, sharper this time, as if she were reminding herself of where she was and what this day meant. She hadn't expected me to actually come, I realized, despite the invitation. Seeing me there disrupted the neat narrative she had built, and that disruption flickered across her face before she smoothed it away and approached me with careful composure. She greeted me politely, too politely, as if we were distant colleagues rather than former partners who once planned a life together. Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched my face, taking in details she hadn't seen before, the tailored suit, the relaxed confidence, the absence of bitterness she might have braced herself for. She said I looked well, and I thanked her, returning the observation sincerely. There was no accusation in that moment, no apology either, just an unspoken acknowledgement that time had changed us both in ways neither of us could fully predict. As we stood there, exchanging pleasantries under the watchful gaze of her bridesmaids, I became acutely aware of how different this interaction felt from the imagined confrontations I'd rehearsed in my head over the past year. There was no surge of anger, no desire to explain myself or demand answers. Instead, I felt oddly grounded, like a man revisiting a place he once lived, now able to appreciate it without wanting to move back in. Lena, on the other hand, seemed unsettled, her attention flickering between me and the bustle around us, as if unsure how much space this conversation should occupy. She introduced me to her fiancé shortly afterward, a tall, silver-haired man with a firm handshake and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He addressed me by name, which told me Lena had spoken about me more than she might admit, and commented on how generous it was of me to attend. I responded with equal courtesy, noting that it was an impressive venue and wishing them well. On the surface, it was a perfectly civil exchange, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of unspoken comparisons, the kind that don't need words to be felt. During the ceremony, I took my seat among guests who knew little of my connection to the bride, watching as Lena walked down the aisle toward a future she had chosen with conviction. The vows were eloquent, filled with promises of security, adventure, and shared ambition, and I listened carefully, not out of lingering attachment, but curiosity. I wondered whether she believed those words as deeply as she once believed the ones we shared in quieter moments, or whether belief itself had become something she tailored to fit her circumstances. At the reception, conversations flowed easily, and I found myself engaging with people from industries adjacent to my own, connections forming naturally without effort. It struck me how far I'd come, how the life I was living now stood on its own merits, independent of any need for validation from my past. Still, I noticed Lena watching me from across the room more than once, her expression thoughtful, almost conflicted, as if she were seeing a version of me she hadn't accounted for in her carefully planned ascent. Late in the evening, as the music softened and guests drifted toward the dance floor, Lena approached me again, this time alone. She asked if we could talk somewhere quieter, her voice low, tentative. We stepped onto a balcony overlooking the vineyard, the night air cool and fragrant with earth and wine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of history pressing gently but persistently between us. Finally, she admitted she hadn't expected me to look so settled, a word she seemed to choose deliberately. I told her the truth, that losing her had forced me to confront parts of myself I might have ignored otherwise, and that growth, while painful, had been honest. She listened, her gaze dropping to her hands, and when she looked back up, there was something like regret there, though whether it was for leaving or for misjudging me, I couldn't say. That conversation didn't end with reconciliation or revelation, but it shifted something fundamental. As I returned to the reception, I sensed that Lena was beginning to question the story she had told herself about who I was and who she needed to be, and that realization, more than any confrontation, marked a turning point neither of us could undo. I didn't stay much longer after that balcony conversation, not because it was uncomfortable, but because I felt something inside me settle into place, like a chapter finally closing without the need for a dramatic final sentence. I said my goodbyes politely, offered congratulations once more, and left the estate while the music and laughter continued behind me. As I drove away through the winding vineyard roads, I expected to feel some grand sense of victory or release, but what I felt instead was quieter and deeper. I felt free, not because I had proven anything to Lena, but because I no longer needed to be part of her story at all. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return fully to my routine, but echoes of that day lingered in subtle ways. Friends who had attended the wedding began reaching out, their messages carefully worded, as if unsure how much I knew or felt. It didn't take long for fragments of information to reach me, pieces of a picture I hadn't asked to see. Lena and her husband, it seemed, were already struggling to align their expectations, discovering that shared luxury didn't automatically translate into shared values or emotional connection. I listened without judgment, aware that I was hearing these things as an outsider, no longer responsible for interpreting or fixing her choices. One afternoon, several months after the wedding, Lena called me unexpectedly. Seeing her name on my phone stirred a brief flicker of surprise, but no anxiety. When I answered, her voice sounded different, stripped of the polish she usually wore like armor. She asked how I was doing, genuinely this time, and listened as I spoke about work, travel, and the quiet satisfaction I had found in my life. When she spoke about herself, her words came slower, heavier, and I sensed that the reality she was living didn't match the dream she had chased so confidently. She admitted, carefully, that marriage hadn't brought the clarity or fulfillment she expected. The age gap, which once felt like an advantage, now manifested in subtle but persistent disconnects, differences in energy, priorities, and emotional availability. She talked about feeling more like a companion than a partner, more like an accessory than an equal. As she spoke, I felt a strange mix of empathy and distance, understanding her disappointment without feeling drawn back into it. The life she had chosen was teaching her lessons I could never have taught her myself. What struck me most was not her regret, but the way she framed it. She didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest reconciliation. Instead, she wondered aloud whether she had mistaken security for happiness, whether the certainty she craved had come at the cost of something more meaningful. I listened, offering no advice, because I had learned that growth can't be outsourced. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time, aware that her questions belonged to her alone, and that my role in her journey was truly finished. Around that same time, my own life continued to expand in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was invited to join a startup advisory board, mentoring young professionals navigating the same early career uncertainties I once faced. I began dating again, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness, discovering that connection felt different now, grounded in self-awareness rather than expectation. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth through sacrifice or patience. I knew what I brought to the table, and I expected partnership, not comparison. Occasionally, I thought back to the list Lena had handed me the day she left, the bullet points outlining why I wasn't enough for the future she wanted. That list no longer felt like an indictment, but a snapshot of two people standing at different crossroads. What once felt like rejection now looked more like redirection, painful but necessary. I realized that had she stayed, we might have slowly eroded each other, compromising values in the name of comfort or ambition. Letting go, however brutal, had spared us both a quieter kind of unhappiness. By the time another year passed, news reached me that Lena's marriage was unraveling, the cracks too wide to ignore. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only a calm recognition that choices, however glamorous they appear, carry consequences that can't be avoided forever. Standing where I was then, grounded in a life built intentionally and honestly, I understood something that had once eluded me. Success isn't about arriving faster or richer, but about arriving whole. And that understanding prepared me for the final realization that would fully close this chapter of my life, a realization that would come when Lena reached out one last time, not as someone who left, but as someone who finally understood what she had lost. Lena's final call came on a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of evening meant for reflection whether you ask for it or not. I was sitting on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one, when her name appeared on my phone again. This time, there was no surprise at all, only a calm awareness that this conversation had been moving toward us for a long time. When I answered, she didn't waste time on small talk. Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable heaviness beneath it, the sound of someone who had finally stopped running from their own thoughts. She told me her marriage was ending, not in explosive drama, but in slow, mutual resignation. They had tried counseling, compromises, and extended trips meant to rekindle something that never fully existed, but the truth had become impossible to ignore. She admitted that she felt lonely in a life surrounded by people, unsupported despite material abundance, and increasingly invisible to the man she married. As she spoke, I realized she wasn't calling to confess failure, but to acknowledge reality, something she had once avoided at all costs. Then she said something that lingered in the air between us long after the words left her mouth. She said that leaving me had been the most decisive choice of her life, but also the one she now understood the least. She talked about how, at the time, she believed love should eliminate uncertainty, not coexist with it, and how she mistook my patience for lack of ambition rather than quiet confidence. She said that standing across from me at her wedding had been the first crack in the story she told herself, the moment she realized she might have traded depth for display. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting her narrative, because this moment wasn't about my vindication. It was about her reckoning. When she asked if I ever regretted losing her, I answered honestly, telling her that I regretted the pain, but not the outcome. I explained that losing her forced me to build a life aligned with who I truly was, not who I needed to become to be chosen. I told her that love shouldn't require shrinking yourself or accelerating your growth to meet someone else's timeline. There was a long silence after that, not awkward, but reflective. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with acceptance rather than longing. She said she understood now that she had been chasing certainty because she was afraid of becoming ordinary, afraid that waiting meant settling. She admitted that she had confused wealth with worth and visibility with value. Saying it out loud, she confessed, felt like finally putting down a heavy bag she had carried for years without realizing it was weighing her down. Before the call ended, she apologized, not just for leaving, but for the way she left, for turning a shared history into a checklist of shortcomings. I accepted the apology without hesitation, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. There was no discussion of second chances, no hint of what-ifs. We both understood that whatever we once were had already served its purpose, shaping us into people capable of seeing more clearly now. After we hung up, I sat there longer than I planned to, thinking about how differently life unfolds when you stop measuring it against someone else's milestones. Lena had chased a version of happiness that looked impressive from the outside, only to learn that fulfillment can't be borrowed or married into. I had been forced to rebuild from rejection, and in doing so, discovered resilience, clarity, and self-respect that no external validation could provide. Neither path was easy, but only one allowed room for growth without regret. Looking back, I no longer see myself as the man who was left behind. I see a man who was redirected. The list she handed me that day, once a symbol of inadequacy, now reads like an accidental roadmap toward a better life. Every point she marked as a failure became a space where I learned to invest in myself, to trust steady progress over flashy outcomes, and to choose partners who valued presence over prestige. If there's one truth this journey taught me, it's that rejection doesn't always mean you were lacking. Sometimes it means you were incompatible with someone else's illusions. Lena needed to live her lesson the hard way, and I needed to lose her to find myself. When she handed me that list, she thought she was closing a door on a lesser future. In reality, she was opening one for me, and years later, she finally understood the weight of what she had walked away from. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.